Welcome back to part 2 of the blood system. This is IB Biology Unit 6.2. In the first part of the video, we will talk about William Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood with a heart acting as a pump, as well as the sino-atrial node's role as a pacemaker, and the cardiac cycle, as well as a diagram that illustrates the process. And let's begin. So the human heart is a double circulatory system, and that means that blood will pass through the heart twice before it gets sent to the tissues in the rest of the body. So when blood circulates from the heart to the lungs and back, that's known as pulmonary circulation, whereas when the blood is circulated from the heart to the rest of the body and back, that's known as systemic circulation. So William Harvey is an English physician that's made significant contributions to anatomy and physiology, and he discovered that the heart acted as a pump to pump nutrients, carbon dioxide, hormones, oxygen, and blood cells to the tissues in the body. And this discovery also explains how body temperature and pH levels can be regulated because, as mentioned in the previous video, the temperature can be regulated through vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So blood pH can also be affected by the levels of carbon dioxide that's present in the blood. So let's take a look at this double circulation process in detail, beginning with the right side of the heart first. The right side of the heart is responsible for pulmonary circulation, so that's like associated to the lungs, whereas the left side of the heart is responsible for systemic circulation. So the left and the right chambers are segregated by this layer in the middle of the heart known as the septum, and blood enters the heart here through the inferior and superior vena cava and the deoxygenated oxygen-poor blood from the body tissues to the right atrium of the heart. So the right atrium then contracts and blood is pushed from the left atrium to the left ventricle through the open tricuspid valve. So when blood fills the right ventricle, it then begins to contract, and that increases the pressure of the right ventricles, and this higher pressure before the tricuspid valve will force the valve close, to prevent the backflow of blood into the atrium. So when the blood pressure before the valve is higher than the pressure that's behind the valve closes, and then the right ventricle will contract, and that propels the blood through the pulmonary valve into the lungs to get it replenished with oxygen and to get rid of the carbon dioxide. And in the left side of the heart, the pulmonary vein will carry the oxygen-rich blood back into the left atrium of the heart, and as the left atrium contracts, the blood will flow from the atrium into the left ventricle through the open bicuspid valve. So when the ventricle is full, it starts to contract, which increases the ventricular pressure, and that causes the bicuspid valve to close behind it. So when the ventricle contracts, the blood leaves the heart through the aortic valve, and then it's delivered to the rest of the body via arteries. And then the cycle repeats. So the cells in the heart are actually myogenic, which means that the muscles in the heart generate signals for contraction by themselves. And the sino-atrial node of the heart will generate these electrical signals that causes the atrium to contract. And then the signal gets passed through the interatrial septum to the atrioventricular node. And the signal is then passed through the interatrial septum to the atrioventricular node. The signal is then relayed from the AV node via something called the bundle of His, or also known as the atrioventricular bundle, which connects to the fibers that's located in the ventricular walls known as the Purkinje fibers. And this causes the contraction of the ventricles. And because of this, the sino-atrial node of the heart is also known as the pacemaker. In a healthy functioning heart, the sino-atrial node sends signals at regular intervals, and that causes the heart to beat 60 to 70 times per minute. But you don't really need to, in our syllabus, you don't really need to know the specific names. You just need to know that the pacemaker functions of cells in the sino-atrial node are located in the right atrium walls of the heart. So now moving on to the cardiac cycle, and in this slide we're presented with a cardiac cycle diagram which shows the phases of systole and diastole, as well as the timings for the heartbeats down here. So just to recap, systole is when the ventricles of the heart contract between the sounds of the two heartbeats, and diastole refers to the period of ventricular relaxation. So this period and that period. So pressure in the heart will increase with each contraction and they will decrease with relaxation. So that's just some clarifications, and blood will flow from a region of high to low pressures. And the sound of the heartbeat is produced with the closing of the bicuspid or the tricuspid valve, as well as the closing of the pulmonary or aortic valves. Now, so let's begin with the cycle. When the sino-atrial node sends a signal to depolarize the atria, it will cause atria to contract, and with contraction, the pressure will build up in the atria. So this blue line indicates atrial pressure, and the red line indicates ventricular pressure, and down here, that's ventricular filling, so the amount of blood that flows into the heart, and this is pressure in the aorta. So when pressure builds up the atria, this forces the blood into the ventricles through the open atrioventricular valves, if you can recall from the diagram in slide 2. So this can be seen in the areas 1 and 2, where the blue line representing atrial pressure is higher than the red line representing ventricular pressure. However, the contraction of the atria only actually accounts for a small fraction of blood that's actually increasing ventricular volume, because as the pressure is actually building up the atria, the volume of blood is already accumulating in the ventricles as it flows through the open atrioventricular valves. And that can be seen from that gradual rise in ventricular pressure, as well as ventricular volume, indicated by the red and green lines. So as atrial contraction completes, the atrial pressure will begin to fall down here. So when the pressure of the pressure gradient here is reversed, meaning that ventricular pressure exceeds the atrial pressure, the atrioventricular valve closes to prevent the backflow of blood, and this is when we hear the first sound of heartbeat, which is also the lub sound, at around 0.3. So this marks the beginning of systole. So a reminder of systole, that's like the ventricular contractions. So at this point, ventricular depolarization will occur, causing the ventricles to contract, and that builds up pressure for a slight moment. In this moment, the semilunar valves are still closed, and the ventricles are contracting in this closed space, which is also known as isovolumetric contraction, because there's no change in volume. So when this ventricular pressure is higher than the pressure is in the aorta, as we can see over here, aortic valve opens. Blood is ejected from the ventricles, and that forces open the aortic and pulmonary valves. So when ventricular repolarization occurs, this ventricular pressure will fall, and that reduces the force of ejection. And when the ventricular pressure drops below the aortic and pulmonary pressure, the semilunar valves close, and that marks the end of systole and the beginning of diastole. So we can see this border between the pink and the yellow area, and that causes this closing of the semilunar valves over here, causes the sound of the second heartbeat, the dub sound, where the valves close. And while all this is happening, the atrial pressure is rising gradually, and we can see that from this climbing blue line. So when the ventricular pressure drops below the atrial pressure, the ventricular filling process is starting again, and we go back to the beginning of the cycle, where the atrial contractions over here at this point completes the filling of the ventricles, and then everything repeats itself again. Okay, so here there's a question on the regarding cardiac cycle that we just talked about, and you can try this out. So the answer is B. In phase 2, the pressure rises in the aorta because the left ventricle is contracting. So we can also check why these the rest of the options aren't correct. So during phase 1, the pressure in the left ventricle decreases while it increases in the aorta during the contraction of the left atrium. So if we look at phase 1 over here, ventricular pressure. So the first giveaway is that the ventricular pressure is actually in fact increasing. So we know that this is the wrong statement. Option C says pressure decreases in the aorta because the left atrium is relaxing. However, I think that is actually because the aorta and the atrium, like how I would go about this is thinking that when the atrium contracts, the ventricle is probably relaxing. So the ventricles will have more of a direct impact on the aortic pressure. Therefore, when the ventricles are relaxing in the pressure, the ventricles are falling in phase 3, that's actually causing the decrease in pressure in the aorta instead of the atrium relaxing. Option D says in phase 3, there's a constant increase in pressure in the aorta as both the left atrium and ventricle are at rest. Well, if you look at the diagram here, it says constant increase of pressure, and we know that's not true, so instantly option D is wrong as well. So moving on to the second part of the video, where we will explain how the heart rate can be changed by impulses brought to the heart through two nerves from the medulla of the brain, and we will describe how epinephrine increases the heart rate to prepare for vigorous physical activity and discuss the causes and consequences of occlusion of the coronary arteries. So, well, the rate of a heartbeat can be controlled by a variety of factors that's ranging from fight or flight responses, the internal environment of our body, such as the blood chemistry, the level of activity we're undertaking. So how this exactly happens, we'll talk about right now. So this is an area in our brain called the cardiovascular center, and that's located in the medulla oblongata. So I think this is like a bit hard to see, but yeah. So the cardiovascular center in our brain located in the medulla oblongata. This center can either signal the sino-atrial node to accelerate or to decelerate. And the nerve that causes the acceleration of the heart is called the cardiovascular accelerator nerve. Which is also sympathetic, and the nerve that causes the deceleration of the heart rate is called the vagus nerve, also parasympathetic. So the factors that affect our heart rate includes carbon dioxide levels, pH levels, as we mentioned before, and blood pressure. So for instance, when the level of carbon dioxide in our body is too high, the blood pH will drop, and that will be picked up by the chemoreceptors and signals the cardiovascular center's senses, and that transmits these signals along the cardiovascular accelerator nerve to the SA node, and that increases our heart rate. So as heart rate increases, more oxygen is sent to the body tissues and more carbon dioxide is removed at a faster rate. And this can be seen during exercising. So during exercising, our body respires at a greater rate, and it also creates a greater demand for oxygen while creating a greater production of metabolic waste that needs to be removed, for example, carbon dioxide. But once the physical activity stops, the vagus nerve will take control of this process, and that's going to cause the heart rate to decrease again. Finally, our heart rate is also affected by hormones such as epinephrine, also more commonly known as adrenaline. So this is a hormone involved in the fight or flight response and is produced by the adrenal glands. So this hormone is released into blood and gets carried to the heart, causing the SA node to emit electrical signals at a greater rate, and that accelerates the heart. So we have more questions which you can just pause and do. And now we have the answers to just check if this is correct. Oh, these questions, by the way, they're taken from Pestle. Okay, finally, the last section of the video, we have atherosclerosis. So let's begin with talking about atheromas. So these are actually fatty deposits that accumulate in the arterial walls, and that's made up of low-density lipoproteins composed of cholesterol and fats. So this plaque buildup will cause the actually increase the risk of cardiovascular diseases that lead to diseases like atherosclerosis, which is basically the hardening of the arteries. So this buildup of atheromas can narrow the arteries, as we can see over here, which causes blood clots to cause an artery blockage. So this process is also known as thrombosis if this clot completely blocks the blood vessel. So more importantly, if the artery blocked happens to be a coronary artery, which is crucial in supplying the heart with oxygen and nutrients, it will cause cell death in that area and subsequently a heart attack. So there are some signs of this buildup of fat deposit, which can be painful due to the restriction of blood flow that deprives the heart cells of oxygen and nutrients. So finally, the last things we have to cover are the causes of plaque formation, and that includes high blood concentrations of low-density lipoproteins. So diabetes, which causes high blood glucose concentration. Also smoking and stress, which causes high blood pressure, as well as diets containing high levels of trans fats. And finally, some cases of bacterial infection, as recently discovered. So yeah, I think that was the last part of the unit, and thank you for watching.